Hi, welcome to Inclusive Imagery by Design. I'm Susan Parker, I use she, her, and I'm an Executive Creative Director at Media Monks. I'm also one of the co-founders of our inclusive marketing practice because I'm passionate about making the world more equitable. And there are plenty of more qualified experts applying DE&I to recruitment and to company culture. So I apply my passion to what I do for work, which is creative. There's a lot of good intent in our industry, but there isn't so much in the way of actionable advice. So I want to share my learnings with you this far, and it is an ongoing learning journey for me. Most of the content in this presentation is contributions from my colleagues at Media Monks, and some of it is also from my personal research. In this video, I'm going to be focused on representation in imagery, but it's also important to acknowledge the value of building diverse teams and creating safe spaces for people to speak up. You know, different lived experiences are going to lead to different perspectives, and that's going to make our work stronger and inclusive when we listen to them. All right, I'm going to switch over to some slides now. All right. So today I'm going to touch briefly on why it matters that the work we create is inclusive. I'll also speak a bit about unconscious bias. And most of this presentation is going to be focused on number 3 there, inclusion in action. So tips to keep in mind and mistakes to avoid when it comes to representation. I'll also share a few things that you can implement to support inclusive creative, things our Media Monks inclusive marketing team is doing. So inclusive imagery considers both representation and portrayal. Representation is who shows up, and we don't need to feature everyone in every image or in every piece of creative. That leads to a sort of one of each approach that doesn't come across as authentic. Instead, a brand's overall marketing should represent the world. But we do want to consider whether certain communities and identities and experiences are maybe being overlooked in favor of others. You'll also want to take into account the audience you're trying to reach and find dimensions of diversity to represent within that audience. For example, if you're appealing to Gen Z, you'll want to show different socioeconomic, different statuses, different ethnicities, different body types within a similar age range. So if representation is who shows up, portrayal is how people show up. And we want audiences to recognize themselves in our marketing through authentic, relatable, positive portrayals. So some of the things you would want to ask yourself are characters in a primary role, or are they in a background role? Are they in a position of power? For example, are they the customer or are they the waitstaff? And then are stereotypes being reinforced? The image on this slide is from Rihanna's Fenty Beauty campaign. And I don't know if you can see it, but the model has visible facial scars that haven't been airbrushed out. And this campaign, or this particular creative, got great reaction from people who haven't seen themselves represented, people with scars. So why is inclusivity important in our creative? Well, as marketers, our job really is to tell a brand story in a way that resonates with audiences. If they don't, and if these audiences don't see themselves reflected accurately in it, then we aren't going to succeed in making that connection. It's that simple. And maybe most importantly, though, is that we have the power to shape society by what we choose to normalize. So we can reinforce the status quo, or we can drive change and have a real and positive impact on the world. This stat shows that clearly most people feel that advertising doesn't reflect the reality that they live in. Okay, so let's try something. In your mind, picture a striking blonde. I'm going to give you a second so you can actually visualize somebody. All right. So many of us probably imagined somebody who looked like this. But you could have pictured somebody who looked like this, or like this, or even this. So unfortunately, most of us were influenced by unconscious bias when I used the words striking blonde. So what is unconscious bias? Why does it happen? Frustratingly, why does it happen? Unconscious bias is the automatic associations that we have about other people, and it can involuntarily influence our behavior. These biases happen because our brains are trying to sift and sort and categorize information about the world. We try to look for patterns because that makes it easier for us to retain information. We take mental shortcuts because we're exposed to so much more information that we can actually realistically process. And then we also lean on past personal experiences as well as social conditioning. So part of social conditioning includes media portrayals, imagery we see in marketing. If unconscious biases invade our work, we're then going to project these back onto society, and we risk making them feel more normal to other people. And that's part of why it's so important to have diverse perspectives in the room, so we can stop each other's biases when they come up and before they cause further harm. The Harvard implicit bias tests, if you haven't heard of them, are really an eye-opening tool. I highly recommend that you go and take one or two or more of them, and they can help you become aware of your unconscious biases. That doesn't immediately erase your biases, but it helps you be more intentional in not letting them impact your decisions and your work. Towards the end of this presentation, I'll put a link on screen so that you can go try out those implicit bias tests. So I'll be speaking in this video about these 8 dimensions of diversity. This is far from a finite list. There are many others to consider in imagery, for example, family structure or geographic location. Are you prioritizing people on the coast over people in the middle of the country? Are you skewing more heavily to urban areas and forgetting about rural? Something else you might want to consider is religion. That impacts dress and symbols and customs as well. It's also important to keep intersectionality in mind as you incorporate diversity into your marketing imagery. Various dimensions of identity layer on top of one another, and as they do, so do overlapping systems of discrimination. And so we need to make especially sure that we're representing those people who are experiencing multiple forms of exclusion. Lastly, to keep in mind, there's no rule book. People with the same lived experiences don't see things the same way all the time. And also, I'm presenting a US point of view, although many of these principles are going to apply globally. Let's dig in. So first of all, race and ethnicity. You don't want your marketing imagery to come across as though you're checking a box. And a few ways to ensure that are: make sure that a person who's the hero is not white, so somebody from a different race or ethnicity. And instead of staging a group artificially to reflect different races, it really is powerful to just pick one person to be the hero. Again, what I said a minute ago, when you look at inclusivity in your marketing, you want to look at it as across a body of work and not one execution. So you don't need to feel pressure to have everybody in that execution. You can pick one person to be the hero. Also, within each race and ethnicity, there are many distinct communities with different histories, different cultures, different physical characteristics. So you want to be specific about who you're representing. These nuanced identities are not interchangeable. Also think about how roles are represented. Is somebody in an empowered or a supporting role? And check that you aren't unconsciously favoring certain races to be more empowered than others in your imagery. Also be careful not to underrepresent families of color and to overrepresent interracial couples in an effort to include as many races as possible. A lot of this is done with good intent, but ends up not feeling authentic and relatable. You can also use clothing to help convey ethnicity. So consider religious head coverings, tunics, saris, bindis, yarmulkes, but just consult with the community that you're representing to make sure that you're not misrepresenting them or appropriating their symbols and customs. This image is Summer Albarca. She is on Instagram. She's a fashion blogger in the modest fashion movement. And I have to say, I use Instagram a lot to follow different people who I wouldn't usually be exposed to in my day-to-day life, and to begin to understand some of their experiences and their identities. So I'll be using quite a few Instagram images throughout my presentation. So moving more specifically into Asian people. So Asian is a broad term that represents about 60% of the world's population. So it's very unspecific. So that this is where it comes into, you want to think carefully about who in particular you're representing. So there's no one Asian American look. Marketers and talent agencies often aren't aware of the physical features that indicate ancestry from a particular region or a country of origin. And so it's important to cost appropriately for the role that you're conveying. Typically, Filipino, Vietnamese, and Pacific Islander communities have tended to be underrepresented in marketing. Gender. So you don't want to perpetuate any stereotypes that exoticize Asian women. You know, the things like portraying them in geisha makeup or as meek or subservient or domestic. As far as recreation, martial arts are in the cultural traditions of many Asian countries, but that doesn't mean that we should assume that all Asian Americans or only Asian Americans practice them. Some East Asian governments have emphasized STEM subjects in their education, which has led to stereotypes that all Asians are good at math and engineering. It's very important to show people of Asian heritage in a variety of professions, just like you would anybody else. There's also a sort of studious Asian stereotype that tends to result in overrepresentation of business settings and not enough home, social, outdoors, recreation. Home and cultural life varies a lot between communities, so get specific about which cultural traditions you're representing and research how those would actually play out. In the US, the vast majority of Asians who are older than 35 were born in another country, but that's not true for Asian Americans who are under 35. And people's personal experiences are going to vary depending on how much time passed since immigration. So for example, a recent Indian immigrant might wear sari every day, but somebody who was born and raised in the US might only wear it for traditional cultural events and celebrations. The image on this slide is from faceresearch.org, and they have created composite images of what the average face from different countries looks like based on crowdsourced images. So it's really an interesting site to go visit and look at. And you can also upload your own a photo of yourself in order to help their efforts. All right. When representing Black people, you want to show a variety of hairstyles, textures, and hair colors. And when you're doing photo shoots or videos, you want to be sure to hire stylists who understand Black hair and skin. Do be careful about borrowing hairstyles that originate in Black culture and applying them to non-Black talent. Many Black women have faced hair discrimination. For example, feeling they have to change their natural hair to fit in at the office. And so it doesn't sit well to see the same style celebrated when a white woman wears them. Also, don't default to only lighter skin tones. With recreation and sports, a disproportionate amount of positive representation has been focused on athletic and entertainment skills, so do be sure to expand beyond that. Less than 50% of Black Americans live in cities, so don't overlook settings that include suburbs and small towns or rural areas. Intersectionality. A lot of Black representation is very one-dimensional. So try to amplify intersectional identities wherever you can, especially Black LGBTQ plus people, because they have also historically been underrepresented. With family, you'll want to showcase a variety of family life, including same-sex partners, multi-generational families, interracial couples that don't include a white partner. And then for context, there's a tendency to romanticize the image of Black people struggling. Instead, you want to show everyday Black life and joy. This photo I love. It's of my extended family having fun together. I feel like the joy is obvious, and I wish I saw more out of it in marketing. For Latinx folks, going straight to work, Latinx people are in every industry and every type of work, so avoid focusing on service and manual labor industries. With sports, soccer is very popular with many Latinx people, and baseball is very popular in Latin Caribbean cultures, but so are basketball, video games, and many other forms of recreation. So don't skew too heavily on those two that I mentioned first. With family, many Latinx cultures place a high value on family, and they live in large multi-generational households. So this can influence how you represent intergenerational dynamics in your imagery. Also be aware that younger Latinx folk are increasingly marrying people who are not Latinx. So you may want to show more interracial marriages for people who are under 35 years old. Be careful not to trivialize cultural moments by treating celebrations like Day of the Dead as a marketing opportunity like Halloween. You want to understand what the meaning behind these celebrations are and avoid appropriation. Food, yum. If you're using food as a shorthand for culture in your work, do some research so that you can be sure that you're being regionally accurate. Tacos and burritos represent a very small part of the overall Latinx food palette. This image is Jorge Narvaez. He is an Instagram creator with a real focus on family and community. Going on to North American and Indigenous peoples. There are 574 officially recognized Native American tribes in the US, and each has its own languages, traditions, and history. So there certainly isn't just one culture. Some objects and imagery are sacred and should really only be used in culturally appropriate ways. For example, headdresses are the equivalent of military medals for many tribes, so showing non-Native people wearing them is disrespectful. In general, showing people using Native clothes, artifacts of culture as fashion or as costume without acknowledging their meaning is going to be inappropriate. Many Native people balance a really rich family life and cultural history with a modern lifestyle that looks like that of anyone else. So it's important not to over-romanticize Native people's lives. As far as environment, when you're picturing daily life, consider only 20% of Native peoples live on reservations. And Native Americans, unfortunately, have relatively high poverty rates. So you're going to want to represent a variety of socioeconomic status. You want to represent folks as protagonists, just as much in charge of their own destiny as anybody else is. And you don't want to inauthentically romanticize Native American life. This image is from the Red Road Project, and it shows how Native Americans often keep their traditional customs as well as adopting youth culture. And on the left is Fast Eddie, who is a powwow dancer, and on the right is a social media celebrity named Two Braids. Skin tone. So within each race, people identify with a wide variety of skin tones. Darker skin tones are often underrepresented, and Asian and Latinx consumers particularly identify with darker skin tones and are often used to represent them. You want to be aware of bias towards showing people with dark tones in certain roles and light tones in others. When it comes to illustration, a lot of us use colors like purple and green in an effort to represent everyone. But in the end, they're not really relatable to anyone because nobody really identifies themselves with one of these, orange or non-skin tone colors. And just to be aware that that yellow color that's used for as the default for many emojis or in The Simpsons is generally interpreted as white. So it's not really a generic tone that applies to everybody. These images are from Pantone's Pantone Skin Tone Guide, which has more than 100 colors that they created by measuring thousands of actual skin tones. Very useful tool. Gender. So truly inclusive representation includes trans and non-binary people, and it takes into account how individuals are positioned relative to others. You want to try to express gender outside of the male, female, cis binary. You also want to balance your representation of trans women to trans men. Typically, trans women are represented more often than trans men. And you want to represent the dynamics between genders positively and avoid seeming to assign more value to one gender over others. This image is Jonathan Van Ness, who identifies as non-binary and was the first non-female ambassador for Essie nail polish. Gender expression. Gender expression is how people express their gender outwardly, and it varies greatly. For women, you want to depict all ages, races, abilities, and sizes in natural and unfiltered ways. Many women prefer realism over manipulated, unattainable beauty. And Gen Z in particular is into authentic, sort of even messy, in real life imagery. Don't over feminize women. You want to also include women with short hair or gender neutral or non-revealing clothing, backpacks, messenger bags, briefcases, all of that sort of thing. Non-binary people do not have one specific look. So some non-binary people choose an androgynous look, but others don't. And don't assume that gender expansive people are quirky or over-index on funky hair colors and funky clothing. Some transgender people send very clear gendered messages in their self-expression, but again, others don't. So you want to portray a variety of looks. And this includes not always representing trans women as ultra feminine or glamorous. Many trans people don't want their appearance to be the focus of attention. Being transgender is deeper than physical appearance, so avoid common cliches of just showing transgender women putting on makeup or wigs or pantyhose, and of transgender men shaving. Some trans men wear baggy clothing to minimize their chest, and they adopt different postures or gain weight to change their body shape, but again, there's no universal. And for all men, consider showing a range of hairstyles and clothing. Men carrying purses, wearing scarves, sarongs, tunics. But do keep in mind cultural meanings and try to avoid appropriation or offense. Okay, gender roles. The US is trending toward less rigid gender roles, thankfully. You want to put transgender people in the same roles that you chose cisgender people, including as spouses, parents, CEOs. You want to show women as empowered, confident in leading roles, demonstrating authority, assertiveness, instead of only in supporting roles. You also want to show women with a variety of meaningful goals. So some of these can be career related, but also in the rest of their life. You don't want to avoid superficial aspirations, like being thin. And I'm sure we've all seen images of women just sitting alone laughing at salads because it's so delightful to be eating lettuce, but that's not really authentic. You want to include women in all sorts of occupations, in construction, as athletes, musicians, entrepreneurs, not only in nurturing or family-centric roles. For men, you want to let go of the traditional gender roles as well and think about showing men as helpers, as primary caregivers, doing domestic chores. Avoid the clueless dad trope. Many men are perfectly capable of making a school lunch or changing diapers without supervision. And then balance, represent a balance of dominant and supporting roles for men, just as you would for anybody else, you know, for example, as a business owner and as an employee. And you want to humanize the lives of gender expansive people. Don't make their gender identity their whole reason for being in your marketing. Disabilities. So 1 in 4 US adults have some kind of disability, and most of us are going to have a disability at some point in our lives. And yet people with disabilities are very much underrepresented in marketing, less than 1% of all ads in the US. So when they're represented, they're often seen either as objects of pity or they're shown as inspirational heroes for simply getting by. Instead, we want to portray people with disabilities as active in everyday life. Have them be the empowered main character, the hero that I spoke about earlier. Have them show them with autonomy, not dependent on other people or not focused on their limitations. Show people with disabilities working, socializing, romancing with people who are both non-disabled and disabled. Don't make the disability the focus, is the point there. There are so many diverse disabilities, but most of us automatically go to people in wheelchairs when we're going to represent somebody in our imagery. But what about people with cognitive impairments, for example? Many disabilities are not visible, but aids can serve as visual cues. For example, a person with epilepsy might have a seizure alert animal with them, or somebody with hearing loss, you might show watching a movie with closed captioning on. Do your research when you're showing assistive devices, because technology is constantly evolving and getting better and more sophisticated. Although sometimes you will want to show older models because they are more financially accessible to people. If you show a wheelchair, skew more towards making it a customized power chair than toward generic hospital wheelchairs. Don't default to putting dark glasses on people with vision impairment. Of course, some people wear them, but some people don't. And avoid camera angles that look down at the person with a disability. This image is Lucy Edwards, pulled from her Instagram. She is a content creator. She's a Pantene ambassador, and she uses the hashtag #BlindNotBroken a lot. LGBTQ plus representation. So marketing should represent LGBTQ plus people meaningfully outside of Pride. Showing up is truly a year-round effort. Consumers can see right through brands that are rainbow washing to suggest that they support the community without really doing anything meaningful. You know, just changing logo colors once a year does not cut it. So make sure that your LGBTQ people that you're representing are shown as complete and empowered, not one-dimensional characters, not secondary characters in the background. Include them in everyday settings, at the grocery store, at the dog park, places where sexuality is not the focus. Far too often we see ads with 2 beautiful white men with some beautiful kids living in a beautiful home on the West or the East Coast. This is not the reality for most folks. So consider women, consider people of color, older people, those with disabilities as well. Don't use drag to signal transgender representation. Drag is performance, and the other is really a lasting sense of self. So include them both, but just understand that they are not the same thing. Watch out for stereotypes like assuming that gay men are flamboyant or that women will appear as butch. And images can be inclusive of LGBTQ plus folks, even when an individual's sexual orientation is not known or there are no people. For example, you can use elements in a scene as cues, you know, maybe family photos or a sticker or something on a mug or doodles in a book. This image is from Not Another Second, which is an exhibit in LA telling the stories of LGBTQ plus seniors who are often overlooked when representing this community, particularly ones of color. Age. Age stereotypes go both ways, but they do tend to be harsher toward people over 50 in marketing. Marketing images are often emphasizing youth and the benefits of being young, and they ignore those who are older completely, or they depict them as being less vibrant. So in general, you want to avoid any negative generational tropes. Gen Z and millennials are actually generally more civically minded and socially conscious than other generations were at their age. And baby boomers can be tech savvy and health conscious and sexual and fun loving. Avoid turning older people into objects of pity or exaggerated bliss, skipping arm in arm along the beach. You want to include older people in work settings and in all role levels. People over 50 make up a third of the US labor force, and many people are staying active in the workforce past retirement age, some of them out of financial necessity, but sometimes purely out of choice. You want to portray older folks as independent and social, with friends, with family. And many older people dye their hair, and they aren't afraid to wear bold color, or they don't use walkers. So check any unconscious biases that may be coming into play. Also, remember that we all interact with different age groups every day, so don't be afraid to show a mix of ages together. This image is one of my friends when she was 73, so clearly not afraid of bold color, having fun. So bodies come in all shapes and sizes, and I'm not just talking about women's bodies here. Some things to consider when you're depicting body types. You should, again, portray a variety. It's sort of a mantra of mine here, not just average or thin. Marketing tends to overrepresent the very thin to average side of the scale. You don't want to perpetuate the sort of Barbie doll standards of beauty for women or the Ken dolls for men. Watch for disproportionately associating certain races with body types. For example, always portraying East Asian folks as very thin. And also be conscious of showing diverse body types when you feature real people and models. So when we use real people, we tend to be more realistic. And when we use models, we tend to choose more aspirational, sort of the old school beauty standards as far as body types. Something to be aware of is that larger folks are often assigned negative stereotypes in the workplace, especially women. And so we can influence that by showing them as successful and powerful. And lastly, pregnant women should also appear doing things unrelated to babies. For example, gardening instead of shopping for baby clothes. Most pregnant people in advertising appear to be in their 20s, although we all are probably aware that many people 30 and over are having babies now. This image is from Somersault's campaign, Everybody is a Somersault Body, their swimwear maker. I love their marketing in general, and this campaign shows many different body types and diversity of other dimensions as well. And it even includes a woman who is nursing. And lastly, for these dimensions, socioeconomic status. So not everybody yearns to live in a minimalist luxury loft apartment. And getting too aspirational can actually feel unattainable and unrelatable. It also overlooks people at the lower end of the scale who tend to be underrepresented, which is actually about a third of the US population. So some things to think about. Avoid showing activities that come across as exclusive, particularly ones like skiing, for example, that take quite an investment over time to learn. Accessibility to activities can also depend on location. So I'm in San Francisco, and going wine tasting may not seem hugely extravagant because it's just an hour's drive away. But for people in other parts of the country, going wine tasting could necessitate airfare and hotels and end up being quite a significant expense. Too much luxury can be alienating in our imagery. Our audiences don't all have marble countertops and mid-century modern living rooms. And if that's all you show, they could assume that your message isn't for them. Very few of us live in huge, immaculate homes, so consider more modest homes and maybe showing a little bit of mess. When showing people running errands, maybe you have them stop at the hardware store or getting their oil changed instead of all being pricey, sort of trendy businesses like hip eyeglass stores or single drip coffee, single pour. I don't know, not a big coffee drinker here. Remember that there's a world full of jobs that don't take place in an office. What if your hero worked in a hospital? What if they drank coffee from a thermos instead of from a to-go cup? And make sure that unconscious bias isn't showing up in your choice of race, gender, age, disability when you're showing low economic status. Great. So now I'm going to share a few things that you can do to support inclusive creative at your company or organization, starting with when your project kicks off. So starting with the creative brief. Inclusivity needs to be integrated holistically into work. It's not a matter of just story. So there's some things you can do when you get your creative brief to help you along the way. One of them, ask what the brand's measurable representation goals are. You can also ask what the audience demographics are, and then ask whether you want to reflect the current state or whether you want to reflect an improved representation. Both of those numbers will help you understand what sort of representation you're aiming for in the first place. Then some more qualitative questions are, is there anything happening culturally now with any dimensions of diversity in particular that could impact how the work will be interpreted and received? So anything timely. Also, is the rest of the marketing over-indexing or under-indexing on specific identities that your work can help correct for? And again, going back to, you want to look at the body of work the whole body of work of a brand, not just each execution as a single sort of one-off. And then will there be opportunity to test the creative or to consult with different groups, in order to check for relevance and resonance and make sure there's no misrepresentation or appropriation? Here's some other things you can implement in your organization that we've learned from what we've been doing at Media Monks. Work reviews. So you can establish panels to review creative briefs and to review creative work through an inclusive marketing lens. Our Media Monks inclusive marketing practice has weekly office hours where we do this. You can do audits. So this involves reviewing past creative to measure how you're doing. You can identify blind spots and gaps and provide recommendations. Media Monks offers this as a service to our clients as well as something that we do internally. And it's really helpful for establishing benchmarks that you can then measure progress against. You can develop tools to help guide your designers. So you can add representation goals to briefs, like I mentioned. You can add guidelines about inclusivity to brand standards or to playbooks. And you can create lookbooks or references of good examples for people to look to for inspiration. And then executional tactics, you can expand your photography and illustration asset libraries with a focus on diversity so that people have images available to them. You can also develop a roster of diverse partners. So this would be directors and stylists and photographers that you can go to when you need their services. And finally, here are some resources that may be handy. Media Monks developed a practical guide to inclusive marketing website, and this is available for anybody to visit. It was a volunteer-led passion project that launched last year and includes tips for creative work, including marketing copy, so it's not just imagery focused, as well as how to conduct marketing research and write creative briefs to be inclusive. I've also got on screen the URLs, they're a little unwieldy, for a couple of articles that I've authored on how to conduct audits of existing creative, as well as a tip sheet for imagery that you can download. I'm including the alias for our inclusive marketing team in case you want to contact us about this topic with questions, sharing challenges you have, anything like that. And then below at the bottom there is the link to the Harvard implicit bias test that I was suggesting at the very beginning of this presentation. So thank you so much for your interest, and thank you for caring about this important subject. I do have a quick request of you. Please go to the URL that's on screen and answer. It's just 4 short questions, and it's anonymous. Your answers will be very helpful for guiding future research as well as content. Thanks again. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you found this useful.